All right, I think we're live. Happy Wonder Wednesday. We're fashionably late, as we like to be. We're today. I'm really excited because I'm broadcasting from my childhood's bedroom, which is really special. So, just a special treat for me, for you. And what's even more special is the events that we're going to have right now at Floxies Community. Just as a reminder, Floxies Community is an international community for women in UX UI design and Webflow development. And every Wednesday, we meet up here in our Gather, our metaverse, and we invite guest speakers from the Webflow world or the design world to come and inspire and teach our community. So today, guest speaker, her name is Carly. She's a Webflow partner, and she will be teaching us some strategy on how to plan your web apps using Wized. I think you pronounce it Wized. Some people say Wized. Let me know how you pronounce it because I'm keen to learn. So let me share my screen. Here we are in our cozy Gather Town space. And let me get to the girls and around the table like we usually do. All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, Edna. Hi, Maria. And hello, Carly. Welcome, into our community. I was just giving a quick introduction on our event today. We're going to be learning a little bit about how to plan for, your first web app, and we will be exploring Wized. And is it Wized or is it Wised? That's my first
It's
question.
whizzed.
It's Wized.
I
All
think
right.
everyone starts off calling it wise, but it is whizzed.
I thought so. I thought so. And some people were like, "Are you sure it's Wiz?" I was like, "I'm not really sure." So I thought that would be my first question to ask. That's,
There,
good. Let's lay down some good foundations.
there we go. There we go.
And I was just saying that you're a Webflow partner, and then, you've been in our community for a while, and I was really happy to see you here in our gather and to finally have you as our guest speaker because, it's one of my goals to kind of highlight and promote and encourage more women in the space to kind of come up as speakers and also get, more visibility out there in the not only the Webflow world, but in general in tech. And so I'm really excited to have you here today. Would you like to give us a little bit of an introduction on your background, maybe how you got to become a Webflow partner, and then we can dive into the Wist world?
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, I was going to give a little brief background as I get in, but it's fine if I just do it up front too. That might save some time later on. Anyway, so I have been working with Webflow since 2016. And that for me was kind of coming out pretty much right out of school. Like all the stars aligned, ended up working with Webflow pretty much right away in my overarching career. And so used that for a few years, and then they started launching like the experts program. So I, wanted to apply for that and was able to be. I don't know. There's so many people in there now, but maybe one of like the I don't want to say first few, but one of the earlier groups. So it's kind of let me see the evolution of that program and the evolution of the platform itself, which has been just wild. I'm sure everybody would agree, kind of how far it's come, and like we kind of see where it might be going, and then all these other tools that are being built for it, and the communities around it. Like it's been amazing. So generally, I work as like a solo Webflow contractor for a lot of different types of companies. I haven't niched down to like a specific industry yet, or maybe probably not ever at this point. I also work with, I bring subcontractors into my projects sometimes as well. So experimenting a little bit on like what it would be like to run an agency sort of vibe situation. But primarily I'm working as a solo contractor, just design, development, site maintenance for companies that have their marketing sites in the Webflow platform. And then with tools like Wiz coming out, I'm clearly exploring more of like the web app space as well. So who knows what might come out of that and where that might take me in the next couple years. You never know. Yeah, but that's a background on me. Unless you have any other like specific questions that you
No,
want me
that's
to answer.
amazing. I was just thinking, how did you come across Wheezed for the first time? What was the need that made you look for a tool like Wheezed? Or, were you looking for a specific
Yeah.
solution? Or, yeah, how did you?
Not necessarily. For me, it was more like, okay, I can see like the opportunity that a platform like this is going to kind of present for us, Webflow developers, Webflow designers. You know, if we're interested in it, some folks might not want to, you know, go down that path so much. But yeah, it was just like, okay, this thing is announced. It's you know, kind of still going to be in the no code or low code space and philosophy, and it works super well with Webflow, like it's for Webflow. And since all of that was the case, I was like, you know, it's time to just kind of dive in and start learning more about all the concepts that are surrounding web apps, because it is quite different from like a marketing website sort of project. So even though it's not public yet, and you might not have access to it yet, I think it's really a great opportunity if it's something you're interested in to just kind of start learning some of the concepts around a web app project. And that's kind of a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today too, is just like, how do you start planning one of these things? What are the different sort of areas you might want to start thinking about?
Yeah, and that's great, because I think it's going to add so much value to what we usually you know, talk about kind of Webflow features or how to implement some new strategies into our builds. But this is a completely new topic that I think we've never touched here at Floxies. So yeah, I'm really excited for it. Do you have any slides for us, or?
I do. Yeah,
Awesome.
I can share my screen. And I'll probably skip through some of this beginning because it is kind of what we started talking about already. So that's totally fine.
Perfect. And if anyone here has any questions at any point, feel free to drop them in the chat, or yeah, just let us know.
Yes, that's that's a really good thing to bring up, Claudia, because as I was like kind of running through what I'm going to be talking about, like I was like, okay, this is potentially a lot of information. So please, I'm going to try to stop and ask if anyone has questions throughout. But if I'm mentioning something or kind of describing something and it's confusing, stop me. This is overall supposed to be, you know, just kind of casual discussions.
It always is. It always is very casual. And as we casually hang out, we learn a ton. So that's amazing.
Awesome. And that helps me too, because I don't want to be like, oh, I'm giving this giant keynote speech about something that's going to make me nervous. At all. So feel free to just jump in at any point. Cool. So you guys can see my screen. Yeah. So planning a web app. We talked about a little bit of this already, but Webflow now has this awesome tool, even though it's not fully public yet, called Wized V2 in particular. It's going to make web app building with Webflow way more achievable than ever before. So today I just kind of wanted to talk about obviously some steps that go into planning a web app project. And then we can kind of talk about a little bit maybe more about why Wized is so exciting. I was going to talk about that first, and then I was like, well, the planning is going to take enough time, so we'll just see if we have more time at the end to maybe cover Wized a little bit more. Anyway, I also wanted to mention I'm not a web app expert yet. Again, like I've really just been diving into this whole new territory over the last month and a half or so, learned a ton. There's a lot of concepts to kind of start learning and exploring. So I can pass some of that knowledge and experience on to you guys today. And then I also wanted to mention this is not going to be a technical deep dive. We are going to focus more on like the planning side of web app project versus like how do you get into Wized and how are we going to use some of these other tools that are brought up today. So it's more about like a planning process.
Perfect.
Awesome. So our example project to get started here, we're going to be kind of planning a web application for a farm co-op. This is just something I'm kind of loosely interested in, so it made sense. If you don't know what a farm co-op is, it's really like an organization that could be run by like a family farm, like a small farm, or maybe a group of small family farms. And then obviously they're producing goods, and then maybe members of their local community can kind of join this co-op and obviously get the goods that the farmers are producing. So there's a lot that could go into an application for a farm co-op. And we're not going to plan the full thing today. We're going to kind of zoom into some specific areas just to keep this talk a reasonable length, of course. But it is worth mentioning like some of the tools that we would want to keep in mind that would be going into a web application project. So our front end, of course, almost goes without saying, Webflow is going to be powering the front end pages of the web apps interface. The back end, which is more of like what you're thinking of if you're thinking of a database, that's going to be powered by Xano. Again, we're not diving too deep. But if you've heard of like Airtable, and that's another option that you could use as like your back end for this. And then our superpowers, like this connector that's going to go between the front end and the back end of our app, that would be where Wized would come in. So it gives us a lot of power there and still staying in like this no code sort of territory. So let's see. Did you want to mention something, Claudia? Sorry.
No, I was like, this is really exciting. I didn't know we were going to dive into Xano as well. That's kind of, to me, whenever I see how Xano kind of works in the back end, I start feeling like whenever Maria tries to teach me some JavaScript, I start seeing like all the numbers floating in front of me. And yeah, I find it a little bit tricky, but I'm happy to see how you use it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's another good time to bring up, like, we aren't going to dive too much into any of these tools. We're just kind of keeping in mind, like, we're going to have a database set up. We can mention it's Xano, and I'll get more into like some things that Xano does specifically, which is why we're like trying to keep in mind from the start, like what tools we would be using.
Yeah.
But really, it's, you know, this talk isn't going to be super technical again. And if you're like a little intimidated by, I don't know, like development things, I'm also absolutely not like a full stack developer by any means at all. And it's really just, you know, there's just a lot of concepts to kind of be learning. But these tools generally are, you know, in the grand scheme of things, more on the no code or low code end versus having to suddenly like, oh, I need to know how to do write all this different code. I don't know, maybe that's another talk we could do in the future, just kind of like looking into a Xano setup at some point. But,
absolutely.
Yeah. So for this planning process overview, I wanted to mention it's not necessarily a linear process. Obviously, we're going to kind of introduce it that way today just because I need to like cover each step. But you'll notice I talk about like, oh, I work on these steps at the same time, or like going back and forth between them. Or it might make sense to you to start in a different place, and it makes sense for me too. And then the other thing I would mention is with the process like this, you don't have to be doing it all by yourself. You can have developers involved, designers involved, like your stakeholders or your clients involved also. Everybody can kind of take away a lot of information from this planning phase or this planning process to then go on and do their own part of the process more in depth of like actually designing fully or actually building fully the web app. So get more people involved, you're going to probably come out with better results anyway. But for this, it was just me kind of thinking through different ideas just to demonstrate today. Awesome. So I think I'm going to actually jump over to Miro now because that's where I kind of visualize everything. Yeah, so I'm going to make sure, yeah, you guys can see that.
Yeah.
Make sure I'm connected here. And I'll be zooming in and out, so let me know if like I'm not ever zoomed in enough for you to be able to see.
Feel free to make your screen full size if you want. I mean, it looks fine on my end, but yeah, you can even go bigger.
You guys off, maybe like that. And I'll definitely zoom in. I should mention though, like for this process, I used Miro, but you definitely don't have to use Miro for any of these steps if you don't want to. Like honestly, for some of the steps, it might not make sense to use Miro. There could be better platforms to be using, but just for today, like having everything in one spot made the most sense, so I could just present it and not like lose my mind jumping between a bunch of different things. Yeah, so I would say the first step that I like to start off with, and I'm going to zoom in now a little, is really just starting off with a list of features and functionality. Like, what are users going to be able to do? What are they going to be able to see inside of your app? So there's just a list here of some ideas to get us started. I generally like to start off also by splitting up features by our different users that are going to be in our app. So like a different user groups or like specific type of user, or a persona is another great way to think about it. So for this example, it would be like the farmers are one type of user, the members of the co-op are another type of user. And so we can just start listing off feature ideas, at least at a very high level, just to get going. So like, for example, for farmers, it would be, getting onboarded to the app, managing members, memberships, managing crop inventory, maybe posting news, announcements, events, managing all the payments, financial info, gathering feedback from members. For members, it would also be getting onboarded, maybe viewing and managing memberships and payments, managing their own upcoming orders, also providing feedback to farmers, maybe like commenting or messaging or voting on different things. So as you can see, like we're keeping this very high level, and for demonstration purposes, this is not an exhaustive list of features, but it's a really good place to start, just getting things documented on like what are we going to have to start thinking about, what do we have to start planning out more fully as we go forward. I don't know that there'd be any questions on this step, but let me know if there is.
Yeah, no, I think we're good. I think we're good on this. Yeah.
This is definitely the most basic one. So for today's purposes, we're just going to be looking at like one of these, which is going to be allowing members to provide feedback to the farmers. And I chose like voting as a really good way to give quick feedback on ideas. I don't know if there's like, oh, we're going to vote on a new pickup location, or we're going to vote on a new crop that's going to be grown next season. There could be a bunch of different things. So that's what we're going to be zooming in on today. And let me get over to our next step here. And again, I'm going to start zoomed out. I'll zoom in just a bit here. Mm-hmm. So next, I like to work on flow diagrams and lo-fi wireframes. I kind of work on these back and forth, like I mentioned, just as different ideas pop up, documenting them in different ways, fleshing out the ideas more and more. I call these flow diagrams just because they're kind of a mix between like a user flow, or it's really just flowing through the specific feature. I don't know if there's a specific term for this. They're just kind of their own thing, I guess. They start off pretty high level, and then I like refine them more and more as I go. Same with the wireframes at this stage. Lo-fi, super high level, not supposed to be taking a ton of time doing it. And you can kind of maybe get more granular or detailed in specific areas depending on what you're thinking about and planning at any given time. So I'll zoom into the flow here for our voting feature. So we might start off like, okay, we're just saying they're signing in, maybe taken to a dashboard page, and then maybe taken to a voting page if they click on that. So that is what I wireframed quickly, is just what would that voting page look like? So again, kept very high level in some areas, like just showing there's a space for a nav menu, space for a hero or a header section, and then getting a little bit more detailed because we might want to know what sort of data is being shown here. So maybe we want to know when the current voting cycle ends. Maybe the user needs to know how many votes they have available to cast at this point in time. Again, maybe they are going to be able to suggest a voting topic. So maybe just indicating somewhere that we're going to have to think through that a little bit more at some point. And then the bulk of this voting page would be like the current items being voted on. So just kind of showing what that could look like a little bit, or at least the types of data that would be included. So like the name of the item, a description of it, like the votes. You could click this and vote for this item, and you can see how many votes have already been cast for this item. Maybe you could even comment on it and just discuss like, this is why I'm voting for this, or this is why I'm not voting for this. And I didn't fully flesh that out, but like maybe you'd click on it and that section would expand and you'd have a little discussion board or something. So again, just very high level at this point. If we go back to the flow, I'm also like jotting that down in this flow here. So there's a node for suggesting a voting topic, even though it's not like, it's very high level at this point. There's also a node again for like adding a comment to a topic. And this is a little bit more thought through of like, okay, is the voting open and they have votes available, maybe some conditionals of like, yes, that is true. Then you could vote on the topics, and then you could just kind of refine it more and more from there, depending on what's going to help you think through this feature the most. It's a very flexible part of the process. For this is kind of where I left it just for today. Just one quick wireframe, one very high level flow diagram. But yeah, that's the gist of it. Like you would just rinse and repeat for if you need more than one wireframe for a certain feature, if you need, to break up this giant flow diagram into maybe more manageable chunks, you can totally do that. And you just kind of keep building out depending on what you're planning first.
We do have a question from Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to pop on, or do you want me to ask it? Whatever.
Oh, yeah. I was just curious. So going back to the feature list.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then talking about your steps, I was curious, is there like a stakeholder meeting that happens prior to this list being created? And then also going back a bit higher level, broader, is there, I guess, like UX research that happens prior to nailing down these features, or what's like your process for that?
Yeah, really, really good question. It's something that I'm noodling over right now for sure, as I start to think more about like, okay, what if I am working on a real client project for a web app? Like obviously, just coming from working on website projects, there's a process where you need to gather information first, like scope the project before you even send a proposal off for it or give a quote for how much is this going to cost, how long might it take. For web app projects, like obviously we can already see how complicated one of these could get very quickly, and how much thinking we're going to have to go through, and how many steps we're going to have to plan. So I think it's going to take some experimentation for me, definitely, as I try to figure out how in depth do I want to scope with a client in that like sales process. How much do I need to see? Like, do I need to know, yes, have you done any user research, or is this just an idea you had that popped into your head and we don't really know where we're going with it? And so we're going to have to then end up doing a lot of research in the process of the project. And that could be a whole other project in and of itself, just helping somebody do their user research and define their personas and their core mission of what it is that they're building. So it's a good question. It's one, I think like the short answer really is just like, I think there's a lot of flexibility there, and it's going to depend on how you kind of want to run your own project. Do you want to be somebody that does facilitate that research for someone, or are you going to have to expect them to like you're going to expect them to be able to deliver research to you and then you use that in the project? Yeah, it's the same with like a website project. So if a client or a prospect comes to me and we're trying to decide, or we're trying to define like what is the scope of responsibility going to be for me or my team, I need to know, like, do you have a visual brand yet? Do you have copywriting for your website? Do you have any graphics? Do you know exactly what pages need to be on there? And are you using any third-party platforms? Like, there's so many questions to kind of uncover up front, so that then, okay, well, this is what we have to work with. This is what we're going to have to do in this project. And so, yeah, it's a big part of kind of what I'm starting to think about more, is like, what is that going to take for a web app project? It's going to be a lot, though. I can say I've been talking, I don't know if any of you guys know about Bailey or Black Peak. They've been using Wized for a long time, like the first version of Wized. And I was talking to Bailey and asking him, like, how do you scope one of these projects? And he says it's something they're still figuring out years after doing this. Just like really getting granular, having to have like multiple calls and meetings with client or leads before actually signing on to a project. Yeah, that was probably way too long of an answer.
That was so great. Thank you, Carly. I got a lot out of it. And yeah, I feel like it's just depending on like what the client, I guess, where they're at in their product life cycle. Like, yeah. So.
And I'm planning on Bailey said this too, like I'm planning on building in a lot of contingencies into agreements. Like we might uncover, we didn't think of this whole chunk of features that needs to happen. We don't know if we're going to run into roadblocks trying to plan or build those. So like, you don't want to box yourself in of saying like, we can get this done in a month and it's going to cost X amount. Like you want to know you want to set expectations right away. Like there's got to be a lot of flexibility here with timeline, with cost. Yeah, that's definitely something I'm going to be keeping in mind and would definitely recommend. You guys do too. Yeah. Okay, so where was I? Talked about flows and wireframes. Okay, this is another big chunk here. We're going to talk about the database, the back end a little bit more. Let me zoom in and get to my notes here. But really the database aspect of a web app, it's like where all of your data is stored, kind of in the name there. If you think of a Webflow website that has that is using the CMS that Webflow provides, you can kind of think of your Webflow collections like as your database, right? And then each individual collection is like a table in that database. It's the same concept for a project like this too, except your database is not natively stored inside of Webflow. It's outside. And for us, like I mentioned, it's going to be like a Xano platform or like an Airtable. And so we need a plan, like what are all those tables? What are all those collections going to be? And what are the settings for each of those tables going to have to be? So to do that, a really good way to do that is to kind of use these little table or schema diagrams, which I'll just go over like how, I don't know, the anatomy of what these are really quickly. So you're usually going to have the name of your table at the top. And then you see below that you have rows with a couple columns. So the right column is going to be the fields in your table. You're going to give each field a name, of course. And then the left column is just kind of jotting down which type of field it's going to be. So just like a Webflow collection, you might have like just a basic text field. You could have dates, times, emails, like image files. So you just kind of want to plan ahead of time what these fields might be. What are you going to call them? What type of field are they going to be? You don't have to nail everything right away. Again, this is like get some ideas out there to get going. As you start wireframing more or doing more of your logic flows or just getting further into the process, you might realize, oh, we also need these other fields that we didn't account for. So again, that's why we're planning all of this out. So I can show you a schema that I've come up with for our voting feature, which is going to include a number of tables. So we'd have like a user table, a voting cycles table, a voting topics table, a voting comments table, a voting suggestions table. It's like everything gets a table, honestly. And I'll go into, I don't want to spend time going through every single field here. You'll get the idea. And I'll zoom in here. But each table or each table or each record or item in a table is going to always have an ID and like a date or a time created. These are two really good pieces of data to be able to work with later on. Also, so it's nice they're just kind of automatically there. So I'm not going to go over that for every table, but just know that they're there. An ID is just going to be a unique number. The date created is just like a timestamp sort of thing.
Why do you think that's going to be helpful in the future to have a field about the date, for example? Because that's something that whenever I create my database, I tend to skip. Like, okay, do I need the date? I'm really curious to know, like, why do you think it's going to be helpful in the future?
Yeah, so it's really nice for sorting things if you want to sort a list of data from your database. And we'll get to that a little bit later too, by like newest to oldest or oldest to newest.
Right.
You can sort, you can filter by date. That could be really useful. Not for everything, but for some things. There's also like, you guys may have run into this too if you're ever building like a blog collection. Like Webflow automatically gives like time created for every record. You can't even change it. It just is what it is. I pretty much always recommend also putting like your own custom date field so that you can control like when was that blog post created. If somebody like, I don't know, deletes it or modifies it, like it could change the data in Webflow, but we don't want that to mess up our like the order of our blog post, for example.
Yeah.
So I think it's always good to just have like a control date field that you can manage yourself.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So for like a user table, there's standard things. You want to know a name, an email, password, avatar. For our voting feature, the only field that's really like unique to that would be like a vote counter field. So that would be like a number field that might store like, oh, if we're going to give them a max of 3 votes, if this user is already at that, we want to know that piece of data so we can prevent them from casting like a million different votes. We have, again, just a bunch of tables in here. So voting topics is another important one for this, of course. So we want to know like the name of the topic, a description of it, who voted in favor of it, and its status, like is it an active topic or maybe it's an archived one, maybe other statuses I didn't think of would be important. So this is a good thing to point out too. For the voted in favor field, this would be a reference field. Same with like Webflow collections. You can set up reference field, multi-reference field, single reference field between them. And this is just saying, okay, this is referring to another table here. So for voting in favor, we know for sure this is going to be connected to the users table, right? So we know how many people voted in favor of it. That would be the most important thing, not necessarily who it is, but just like keeping a counter, essentially.
Yeah, and just to sum up, so we started with kind of describing the personas for our web app, and then we moved on to having a flow chart on what the actual users are going to do within the app, and then kind of a wireframe or lo-fi on what the app itself would look like. And now we're looking into the database and all the data that we're going to store and how we're going to store it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good summary. Right.
Just yeah.
Yeah, we're jumping between a lot of things here. Some areas that maybe the designer would be more in control of if there are multiple people working on this. Some areas that the developer would be more in control of. This would be an example of that, like database things the developer would be kind of more in charge of. Yeah, so another table here would be like voting cycles. If we're going to say a voting cycle is a week, we want to know, well, when does that start? When does that end? So we want fields that control that. Reference field to the topic, so we know which topics are being voted on in this voting cycle. Also voting suggestions, so a table that would hold if the members suggest any ideas, where is that data going to go? If they send that form off on the front end of the app, we need to store it somewhere. So we'd have a table for that. A table for comments too, which we're not going to dive too much into today, but just noting that it would be there. Yeah, that's database schema. So really just starting to plan. I can also show you and you can think of a Webflow collection here too. So this is like a actual table view from Xano of the voting cycle table. So we talked about those IDs or those fields, the ID field, the created at field, the cycle start date, end date, a field that refers to the topics table. So it all matches up. So if we plan all of these ahead of time, once we get into our Xano or our Airtable or wherever we're building our database, we just know this is exactly what we have to build. We don't have to think about it now. It's all set up for us already in terms of planning.
It doesn't look as intimidating as I imagine the Xano. It looks quite similar to Airtable.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And I've heard, don't quote me on this, but I heard they're doing a bigger overhaul in Xano of their interface to make it a little bit more user-friendly, like an Airtable. Yeah. I don't know when that's coming or exactly what that's going to be, but I was excited when I heard that because I did experiment with Airtable first, and it's so nice, so nice to use. They've done such a good job.
I'm very easily pleased. Just give me a nice UI interface and I'm sold.
Yeah. The problem with that was, so I started using Wized with Airtable, and you could really see like it was slow to kind of load things, slow to request information, and that's obviously hugely important to your user experience. You want things to be fast.
Yeah.
And Wized is only like as fast as the backend that you're connecting it to. So Airtable, unfortunately, was just way slower. I switched over to Xano, and everything's just like lightning speed.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it was a bit of a bummer at first, like just the realization, like, oh my gosh, I know Airtable. I have to learn Xano now to do all this. Like, it was kind of a bummer, but it wasn't crazy to learn whatsoever. There's a lot of documentation, and it's worth it. For sure worth it. If you're kind of considering what to dive into, Xano, I would definitely recommend.
Perfect.
Cool. Any other thoughts or notes or questions about the database portion of this?
Let me just look around the chat here. I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good too.
There might be, if you have more as we get further, just let me know, because the next bit it's pretty chunky and there's going to be a lot of things introduced. So again, stop me if we need to stop.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I think we're good. I think we're good.
Cool. So I'll zoom in again to this. So give me a second here. Now that we have our database for our voting feature planned a bit, we can look at different types of requests that we might need to create in order to interact with the data that is in that database. You could also hear the term query, like a database query when it comes to this sort of thing. I'm going to use the term request. It's the one that Wized and Xano uses. Well, Xano also uses query, but anyway, query, request. Again, requests, they're just things that will allow us to get information from our database or send information to our database. And for each request that we're going to plan for, there's a number of little bits and pieces that we want to plan. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I like to plan, obviously, the name of the request, the type of request that it is, what triggers the request. Are there any conditionals for it being triggered? Does it require any inputs? Does it need to have any functions or like logic built into it? And then once the request runs, what is it going to give us to work with? What is it going to return? What type of data do we have, and what does it include? So I can go into a couple examples here, like what a request could be. So for our voting, we are definitely going to want to get a list of voting topics to be able to work with, right? So we're getting data from our database, our voting topics database, pulling it into our front end so that we can show the user what they could vote on. So that type of request is going to be a data in request. We're getting data from our database, bringing it in. That's also called like a GET request. And then for this one, I'll zoom in a little bit too. So our triggers are going to be on page load. The user doesn't have to do anything to trigger this request aside from just like being on the voting page, right? Now is a really good time, and stick with me, to introduce attributes in all of this. So let me zoom over and show we have our wireframe here, and let me zoom over even more. So if you have ever worked with FinSuite attributes system, which is amazing, powerful tools to use with a Webflow project, a lot of that is tied in, like in the name, to the attribute of our elements that we're working with in Webflow. So we have this custom attributes little setting panel in Webflow where for Wiz specifically, the name of it is always going to be WL. And then it's the value of the attribute that we are kind of setting a name to help describe what this is. So we need to set that in order to like work with any of our elements in Webflow and have them like connect over to Wiz. So it's a part that we want to plan for. I don't want to overwhelm anybody at this point. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does.
Cool. So I'll just note here, like this is a great way to start planning these, is just use your wireframes and start jotting down like which elements might need to have an attribute. What do you want to call them? So like for the hero header, that's where I might just put our voting page attribute. It's the header on the voting page. It's just defining or telling us this is the voting page, and it's going to trigger that request that we just were talking about, which I'll get back over to in a second. We also might want to add attributes on our different voting items. So just maybe the div that's wrapping each item is going to get the voting item attribute. Maybe the element that is the name or the topic name is going to get the voting item name attribute. And then we have, again, like a description. So maybe we'd give that the attribute of a voting item description, let's say. So keeping that in mind, if we get back over to this request, which again, we're getting a list of voting topics to work with. On page load, if the attribute voting page exists, so we gave that attribute to our header hero on this page, we're going to run this request. Pretty straightforward there, even though there's a lot of little steps in there. Then each request might need an input, it might not. This one does not, because we're getting information from the database. We're not really telling it much else than that. But another big thing to plan for is, for each request, is there any logic to it that we're keeping in mind, any functions? I'm using the term function because that's what Xano uses. Don't overthink it at this point, because this is kind of something you'd be thinking about no matter what backend platform you're using. So for this one, again, we want to like get our list of voting topics, but we don't necessarily want all of them. We don't need to necessarily work with all of them. So maybe we want to filter that so that only items that have an active status, which, remember, that's a field in our voting topics table. Only those with the status of active are going to be returned to us. Same with sorting it. So we want to maybe see the item first that is the highest voted at the time and kind of go down from there. So we maybe want to add a little logic or a little function to this request that is going to do that for us. So things like that, you're just kind of starting to think about and plan. And then the last step that I like to plan for when planning a request is the response. So what, after all is said and done in this request, what are we going to have to work with? So in this instance, it's going to be a list or an array, like just a list of the filtered and sorted voting items. So a lot of steps there. I have another example.
I love the way that you structured, the whole plan, because I tend to just jump to the result, or like, oh yeah, let me just look at the front end because I need to see what it looks like, and then I end up messing up something in the database or skipping a field, or so I really appreciate a clear structure, and it's definitely something that I have to learn from myself. Kind of be patient and lay this out first before working on the front end. Yeah,
that's really what kind of forced me to really come up with a process like this, because I was in the weeds and just like you said, forgetting fields, forgetting like what was I even trying to do with this data? Like, I don't even know. It becomes a lot very quickly. So that kind of surfaced this need for like, how can we just plan and organize this? And again, like, I'm using a Miro table for this, which is like probably not the best way. Like a spreadsheet would probably work just fine. Just for presentation purposes today, keeping it all in one place, Miro worked. But yeah, it's really more about like the important things are the data points here. That what are the little pieces of information that we want to plan, and then the format that you use to do that's totally up to you. Cool. I think it is good to kind of go over another type of request, because the first one was like getting data in to our app, like taking data from our database and then using it.
Let's get the that data out.
Yeah, the opposite. So getting data out or posting it to our database. An example of that we've talked about, we could let members suggest topics to vote on. So maybe there's going to be, and we'll go over it, a little form they can fill out, send it. Then what happens? We need to like set up all this stuff to make sure that actually is going to work. So we can do that with a request, a data out request or a post request. The triggers for this request is actually going to be action-based, not on page load, like the user has to do something very specific for this request to run. So we're going to plan that this is going to be the user's going to click on a button, a specific button. And then there are also going to be inputs for this request. We need to know what data is actually being sent out. So for a suggestion, a voting suggestion, we're looking for a name, or our database is looking for a name of the suggestion and a description of it. Those, I have these split into their own little post-it here just because those are like manually controlled by the user inputs, like they're typing something in. Over here, I've split out another couple of inputs that our table is going to be looking for. These are more automated though. We need to know our database table is looking for who suggested this suggestion and the date it was created. So when was this form submitted? We don't need the user to fill out input fields of like, what's my name? What time is it right now? It's automated on the back end, just being able to kind of send into Xano or our database. But we still want to account for those in our planning. And then, so for the function or like logic layer for this request, honestly, it's not very complicated. We're not sorting, we're not filtering, we're not doing anything special. We're just adding a new item into that database. And the response is going to be what that new item was, really. So again, quite basic and not super complicated in terms of having to add a lot of logic to it at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So requests, I mean, you're going to be setting up like a million different requests in your web app. I mean, this is just like touching the surface of just one feature of a web app. So you could really imagine like this is going to become very expansive very quickly. And it's very time consuming, honestly.
I can tell.
Does anyone have questions on requests at this point? Maybe not.
Let me see. Doesn't look like it. Rachel from YouTube says, so detailed, love a good plan. Hi, Rachel. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's honestly not the most fun part of everything. Like we all just want to get in and start building, right? Especially when you're learning the platforms. And that's honestly what I've been doing too.
I definitely want to have a part 2 with you where you show me all the fun stuff as well.
Yeah. As I learn more and just get more comfortable and feeling like I could probably explain this without getting lost in the middle of it, maybe I'll come back and we can do that.
Oh, yes, please.
Cool. So I just want to show you guys one more piece of what I like to plan here, and that's actions in our web app. So if we think about our requests, again, they're getting data from our database or sending it to, but it's just data. Like we aren't actually like working with it yet. We just have it, if that makes sense. This is kind of something that took me a little bit to wrap my mind around too. So the next step is like actually setting up actions to like work with the data that we've set up with our requests. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yep.
I think it will when we get into the details of like some examples here. Yeah, so for request or for actions, sorry, let me zoom in here. I like to plan again on another like list of little pieces of information. So the name of it, the attribute that it's tied to, we'll go over that. And then configuration steps for the action. There could be multiple steps that you have to configure. Just depends on the complexity of what's happening with the action. So let me get into an example. So if we think about our request that was getting a list of voting topics from our database table, now we want to be able to work with it. So we want to actually show the list of data on our page, right? The request, all it was doing again is just getting a list for us and like holding it for us to work with. Now we're starting to work with it. Really what we need to do is render that list onto the page. So an action would be the page is looking for a voting, an element with the attribute of voting item. So if we remember in our wireframe, we have like that div for each voting item with the attribute voting item. And the configuration for this action is we're just going to render a list using that voting item element and the data that was returned from our request up here. Does that make sense? Cool. So now we have the list kind of starting to populate on the page. But if we don't set up anything else, all that would happen, oh, this would have been good for me to visualize. It's like we're just going to have a bunch of empty divs with like our generic, like literally if we put this in Webflow and like typed in the words like voting item topic name, we're just going to see that like over and over. It's not going to actually be the real data from our database, if that makes sense. Almost like a collection in Webflow.
Yeah.
You're like setting up a collection template, but you didn't connect the actual data yet. You're just seeing the template basically. So that's what we need to do. We need to set up actions for like all the little bits of data. So like an action that's going to set the text of the current topic's name.
So like mapping, a little bit like mapping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the attributes are what you're kind of mapping to. That element is what's being mapped to with being controlled by the attribute, if that makes sense. Same with like the descriptions, we need to set a separate action for that. So again, we can start seeing pretty quickly there's going to be a lot of actions to start accounting for. This is just scratching the surface of like one piece of one feature. So it gets pretty crazy pretty quickly. Same with like the topic suggestions. And I want to go over this one just because it's a little bit more complex in the configuration. So let's say somebody clicks on the suggest voting topic button. Maybe there's a little form modal that pops up. It could look something like this. Because if we think back to our request for suggesting a voting topic, our post request, it's looking for a topic name and a description. So those are our fields, right, that we need to fill out. And then this action is going to be tied to this button in this form. So we're going to give it a topic suggestion form submit attribute, like really whatever name makes sense to you. So that action is looking for that attribute. And on click, we're going to perform the request, post a new voting topic suggestion. So on click of this button, we're going to do this request right here. So it's a little crazy. And then we can stack configuration too. So this might not be the best user experience, but for example, you could then say, okay, also on click of this button, we're going to send this request. And then we're going to navigate to a thank you page or something like that. So this is where you really get a lot of control over what is happening when a user does something in your app. There's a lot of little steps to plan for. And I didn't even touch on like really deeply into, you can do conditionals. Like if somebody clicks on this and the form wasn't filled out all the way, okay, you don't want that request to send. So you start planning for all these different edge cases of like, are we going to show an error message? Are we going to, like, what are we going to do? Yeah, I didn't do all of that today because that you can very quickly see like just how many little bits and pieces have to be accounted for.
Definitely. And this can apply to any, to a design process, or, it's kind of a really nice structure to be thinking on everything, that happens when you're designing either a website or a web app. Obviously here there's a lot more data involved, but the kind of steps and choices that you're making also make me think that this could be really useful for designers as well when they're thinking of redesigning a website, or just like really taking account of each and every little step that your user is going to take. So yeah, this is a good example.
Awesome. No, it's a good point to bring up. I mean, planning for any type of project that we're working on is hugely important. And then just starting to define what that process is for new projects that you haven't really worked on before. Like it's going to be trial and error for sure. And it just takes some practice and really diving into the tools without a plan sometimes and just figuring out like, how do they work? What different pieces of information do we even need to consider? So there's no pressure. Don't put pressure on yourself. I'm trying not to put pressure on myself to like get it all right away, because we're all, just learning
Yeah,
learning
and
this
these
together.
tools, I mean, they keep changing every day and new ones
Yes,
pop up every day. So yeah, never feel overwhelmed. If you ever do, there's always going to be a community of, like-minded people or people in the same situation as you. So
for
yeah,
sure.
we're in this together.
Yeah, but that was really all I wanted to show today in terms of the planning process, and we've already like hit an hour, which is nuts. That kind of flew by. Yeah, if there's any last questions or anything just about the planning process or my thoughts on Wized or whatever, I'm happy to answer anything.
Let's see, I'm just gonna look at the people here around the table. Hi everyone, is everyone doing well? Are you all like brain fried, or how's this for you? Has this been okay? Do you have any questions in terms of Carly's strategy for planning, or specifically about Xanor or Wiz, or anything you might like to ask? Penny's got her hand up.
I was just going to say, Carly did a great job of explaining all of that. Especially because you haven't been working with Wized and Xanol for all that long. You've got a really good understanding of how database structure works. So that was really well done. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope I almost felt like it's kind of possibly nice in a way to be introduced to some of these different concepts or terms without diving so much into the technical visuals of it all. Like you can kind of wrap your mind around like what is a request, what is an attribute, what is an action without, and it can be less intimidating than if you're also trying to learn the interface of like how to set all this up.
Right. Well, and the other thing is you can actually use this sort of same process a little bit, even just with the Webflow CMS, because if you're connecting different elements in terms of, grabbing a category from somewhere and then an item from somewhere else and connecting them, even this process can help with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Kathleen?
Yeah, so I had a question for, I guess, like the type of brands that you've been seeing in your world who are using web app products. Like, are there specific types of niches that are more interested in it, or types of businesses? Because what I can just see already is like SaaS type businesses are interested, but I was just curious from you and your experience.
Yeah, definitely that. And that, I mean, the marketing sites that I work on, again, I haven't niched down, so I do work on like a range. They're definitely leaning more and more towards SaaS. So I think like the Webflow sphere, while it is very, I mean, there's so many different types of companies using Webflow for their marketing sites. SaaS is like just, I don't know. It just kind of works well with their whole vibe of like how they run their marketing teams and all of that. So they tend to gravitate towards Webflow, I feel like. And there's a lot of opportunities for them to build little applications and tools, potentially with Wized. I'm also seeing, again, Bailey from Black Peak recently shared on Twitter one of his recent projects, which was, I would describe it as like luxury real estate rentals, if I remember correctly, and like renting those out. Like there's a whole system of like, which we obviously haven't seen yet because you have to like log in, you have to have an account, you have to do all that. But you can kind of get a gist of like at a high level probably what's going on that end of things. And it's like bookings, rentals, communicating with I don't know, the clients that are potentially renting the different rental properties. I don't know. So luxury things too could be an interesting space to look at.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. Definitely something that I'm going to be doing more research on too, as I start maybe more publicly showing that I offer these services. Like, who am I going to be trying to target with this?
Exactly.
Yeah,
because I was just interested too, like what are like the, I guess, key business problems that they're trying to solve with this type of product as well. So
yeah, totally. And it's just not like, it's just, again, so much more achievable now to like wrap your head around being able to offer these types of services as somebody really into Webflow, because again, Wized is for Webflow specifically. So it's just, there's a lot less, there's a learning curve.
Yeah.
As you can see, there's a lot of other things to start learning about, but tech and the setup behind it all, like you can wrap, or I can at least wrap my head around it way more easily than starting to learn. I don't know. I looked into like Bubble like so many different times, and like every time I log in, my eyes glaze over. Like I cannot find the motivation to figure out how to use that thing. As soon as it was like, oh, we're gonna be able to do this kind of stuff and also use Webflow.
Yeah.
Like now's the time. All right, I'm gonna start learning it.
Awesome.
And that's when I guess, having the idea and your planning system really comes to work, because if you have that solid starting point, then the tools is something that comes after. What's the easiest way I can produce this, and what's the tool that allows me to do it in the shortest time in the most efficient way. So yeah,
for sure, a huge part of that, and like this has been a part of being able to scope and do proposals for Webflow projects, is it's like you need to know what the limitations of the platform is. You don't, like, way before now we have all of FinSuite attributes and so many amazing tools to like use with Webflow, but back when I first started, it was like you couldn't even take on a project that had like basic filtering unless you knew how to code, in which case you probably weren't using Webflow anyway. And then you had to hack like Webflow's tabs elements. Like it was very, very limited. So you never
very scrappy. Yeah.
You had to know what were the limitations, or like what is this able to do natively? If it's not native, is there a way for me to figure out how to do this without like losing my mind? And if not, like you need to be able to say no to a project, honestly. And it's going to be the same with this too. So now is like the time to like dive in. If this is something you're interested in, like working on these types of projects going forward, like dive into the tools, figure out what their limitations are, figure out what they're very good at doing. Do you want to learn how to do all this? Do you want to partner with somebody that knows a bit more or is interested in a specific area? It's the same with website projects too, but I think just like taken to another level with web apps, just because they're more complicated.
Yeah, definitely. It's so helpful though. Thank you, Carly, for the entire like framework. That's how I work too. Like I just love structure, so it helps a ton.
Yeah, it is fantastic. Can we be cheeky and ask you for a copy of that?
Sure. Now, here's my limited knowledge of Miro. Is it easy to share? Like, I don't have a paid Miro plan.
Oh yeah, it's easy to share. I use it. Yeah, it's really good. You just share. There's a share button at the top right. Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome.
I can find it now. I'll drop it in the chat. If not, I'll drop it in our Discord.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Carly. This has been amazing, amazingly detailed and super insightful, and definitely useful for, so many use cases that go beyond web apps and, everything. So yeah, thank you so much. And whenever you want to come for a part 2 and show us how it translates into a visual tool, more than welcome to. That would be amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, and hopefully they'll be opening up more Wized invites soon.
Yeah,
so people can check it out.
Yeah, of course, that would be great. And before wrapping it off, I guess me and Penny here would like to just invite you all again for our Christmas party on Friday. No Code North and Floxies Community are kind of getting together and celebrating the holidays together, which is absolutely fantastic. So if you haven't registered for our party yet, I'm just gonna drop the link here in the chat for you to do so. It would be absolutely amazing to see you and to spend some time together, just a casual hangout and say goodbye before the holidays. Yeah, with our lovely friends.
Come and join us. Wear your best toque.
Yes, and bring mulled wine.
That too.
All right.
Fun.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carly.
And I'm
just
going to
welcome.
say,
Claudia.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. Anytime, any Wednesday or any other day of the week on Discord. And yeah, I'll see you on Friday for our Christmas party. So I'm just going to say goodbye to the YouTube and to everyone here. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.